All right, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody to the International Contest and Table Topics, the Judge How to Use the Ballot webinar. It is Sunday, March 25th, and I would thank you very much to our panelists for being on the call and to all of the individuals who have called in to listen and watch our webinar. My name is Sharon Joseph, the District 45 Online Education Webinar Chair, and I'm proud to be bringing you these topics. And of course, as Mark Henkel and I were talking earlier, we're always looking for opportunities to have other individuals present, bringing forward topics that they feel passionate about, that they want to share with fellow Toastmasters, so that we can continue to learn and broaden our scope as individual speakers and leaders. Our agenda for tonight: we will introduce our panelists. We have two individuals who will be sharing with us, and of course, as always, it is an open discussion. I encourage everybody who is on this call to offer up their guidance and their suggestions. We have so much experience on this call, and so many individuals who can offer up some great points of learning for everyone to share. This is being recorded and will be up on our District 45 YouTube channel once it is ready. We will review the Judge's Guide and Ballot just to give everyone a point of focus as to what we're talking about. Then we'll go into the subject of how to actually use the Judge's Ballot, and if we have time, there are some reminder slides that I put together to help people, to remind people about judging and key bits of information with regards to judging and the Judge's Ballot. So first of all, what I'd like to do is I'd like Mark Henkel to introduce himself. He's one of our panelists for this evening. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Karen. Hello, my name is Mark Henkel. I am a distinguished Toastmaster. I have competed in several contests and been on the District 45 contest stage a number of times, including trophying in the International Speech Contest. I've also performed every single role in the contest, from chairing to chief judge to ballot counter, and I am very committed to accuracy of contest judging. So I'm glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
That's wonderful. Thanks, Mark. And Nita Patel is our other panelist for this evening. Nita.
Thanks, Sharon and Mark. Good to have everybody on the call. My name is Nita Patel. I'm a Toastmasters member in District 45 and Division A, and I've been a member for almost, it's about 16 years now, so it's getting up there. Similar to Mark, I've done many of the roles, and I believe contests are one of the very nice ways in the Toastmasters organizations to have an opportunity to not only showcase people's skills, but to provide a somewhat objective way to characterize presentations and the impact of presentations. So I'm passionate about judging. It's extremely important to be unbiased and fair, but also to be very focused on the criteria. So I'm excited about this presentation tonight, where we'll learn a little bit more about the judging.
Thank you very much, Nita, for that introduction. So a question to both Mark and Nita. When you started with Toastmasters and a contest came along, did somebody just give you a judge's ballot and said, here you go, be a judge, and you learned your method on how to use the ballot through trial and error, or did somebody guide you? How did you get to a point where you became comfortable using a judge's ballot?
Me or Nita first?
Either one. Mark, go ahead.
Well, for me, my first experience was actually, it was just handed to me, said go for it, do whatever. I was actually given no guidance, and I really wasn't satisfied both with the way the results of that contest went as well as what I did myself. I did not feel that I was informed or educated enough about it. It wasn't actually until I had competed at a very serious level after first getting my Distinguished Toastmaster, because I wanted that quickly, and you can't compete while you're doing district office role. But once I had done that, and then I got into serious competition, that I realized just how crucial and critical the ballot is, because I actually would design my speech according to the ballot. And so I've come to recognize just how important that is. And for us as judges, we need to be committed to that, because that's what the basis of our contestants are relying upon us as judges to use when we're judging them.
Great point, Mark. Great point. And competing, I find, opens your eyes to a number of different aspects to the Toastmaster program, and coordinating with the ballot is absolutely one of them. Thank you. Nita, did you have something?
I actually had a different experience than Mark. I did get training in a sense. It probably wasn't as formal as what we're doing on this webcast or an in-person training. However, it was a 20-minute explanation of the ballot, the expectations, a little bit of comparison between the difference as an evaluator versus a judge, and I think that was very meaningful to get that framework established up front and have a sense. And I appreciate that I was trained when I first was asked to be a judge, because I think it's essential to understand and appreciate both the differences between judging and evaluating as well as the criteria on the ballot. They're very specific, and they're structured very specifically to help us focus on key attributes of the presentation as opposed to letting our subjective senses take over. The ballot provides us this objectivity, and it's still a bit subjective, but it makes it a lot more criteria-based, and that allows for comparison against individuals, against the criteria, not necessarily against each other, because the goal is to look at each individual against each criteria, and then at the end, you'll get a tally and be able to sense that. So I appreciated that. My mentor helped me get started in a positive way with that appreciation.
Great point. Thank you very much. For anyone on this call, is there anyone else that has a different experience from both Mark and Nita in terms of their introduction to the judging and the judge's ballot?
Yeah, I could chime in. This is Jeff. I actually first was a Toastmaster in another district far, far away from here. And my first experience was we went through a formal training. It was actually, I think it was either 1 or 2 hours. To be honest with you, it was so long ago, I don't remember. But there was a formal training that was conducted by the district chief judge. So yes, that district had a chief judge that went around to all the different division TLIs and did an hour-long training at each of the TLIs. So that was my first experience. I had some formal training on what the ballot is, how it works, and kind of the importance of trying to be objective.
That's awesome. Jeff, something to think about, maybe? Hint, hint.
Hint, hint. I know that's honestly that's part of why we're doing this this webinar, yeah. And we're working in that direction.
That's wonderful.
Yeah. Our district has other challenges, though. It's physically impossible for a single chief judge to get around to all the divisions.
Yeah, I was going to say if we have a teleportation machine of some sort, then of course that cuts down the distance and shrinks our district down quite a bit. However, the reality is we don't at this point. Does anybody else have anything to offer at this point? All right. So at any point, if you have any questions, please feel free to go ahead and either ask the questions or put it in the chat. We are definitely monitoring the chat. Very quickly, I want to take a look at the judge's guide and ballot, and then I would like to pass it back to Mark and Nita to help us with the method that they use for the judge's ballot. So for the International Speech Contest, there are 3 sections on the ballot. There's the content, which represents 50% of the final mark. And under content, there's speech development, effectiveness, and speech value. Delivery is 30% of the final mark, and delivery includes physical, the voice, the mannerisms of the speaker. The last section on the ballot is language, which counts for 20% of the final mark, and it is appropriateness of language and the correctness of the use of language. For the table topics ballot, It's the same three categories divided differently or counted differently. Content is 55%, speech development and effectiveness, delivery 30%, where it's physical and voice, language 15%, appropriateness and correctness. So those are the ballots that we will be, or that for the upcoming contest, those are the ballots that will be used by our judges. This is how the ballot is laid out. We have the judge's guide at the top, used to help you select a winner. It is confidential, and you must destroy it after the contest. It is not to be shared with anyone. This is your or the judge's part where they're marking based on the different criteria. And the judge's ballot at the bottom, you must allot a first, second, and third place. No ties are allowed. It has to be signed, and it must be legible. So I'm going to leave it here for a moment, and then I'm going to come back to Nita and Mark. So we'll start with Nita first. Ladies first, Mark, sorry. So we'll start with Nita. If you want to guide us through how you use the ballot most effectively, or what you have found works for you. Did you try anything different that didn't work? So share with us, if you will, the good, the bad, and the ugly, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure. I actually, as I'm sure many people in Toastmasters, use the ballot in reverse order. So when the speaker order is announced, whoever is speaker 1, I put them in column 10, and speaker 2, if there's enough space, in column 9 or 8, and space them out if possible. If not, then in that reverse order, that allows me to flip the edge of the ballot over as each speaker is progressing, and not dully my previous ratings and have influence on whatever the next speaker is doing. So that way I can force myself to be even more objective. That has worked well for me. In terms of how I approach, I've tried quite a different number of ways to use the ballot. In some cases, I've tried to only look at the top 4 categories: excellent, very good, good, or fair, and then pick the center number in each category. So for, let's say, speaker number 1 under speech development, I might think they were very good, and in that case, I would pick 26 as the number I would give that person, and used it that way where I don't worry too much about the fine details. I've also tried the method of being very specific about the numbers and really trying to gauge, okay, which end of fair is it, which end of good is it. Ultimately, I've settled on 2 layers. I use the 4 categories at the top, and then a high, medium, low within each of the subcategories. So people that are fair but not all that fair would maybe get a 0, and people that are fair but really quite good at the fair end might get a 16, for example. That seems to be working for me. I have not tried the other forms that I've heard about, like using pluses and minuses, or just simply rating it right in the middle for the first speaker and then incrementing up or down for subsequent speakers. Those don't seem to work too well for me. I like to use my 2-tier approach. The second element of addressing the ballot is the order in which I tackle the judging. As everybody knows or maybe doesn't know, judges are given 1 minute at the end of each presentation to mark their ballot. 1 minute, I've found, is not really enough for me to do justice. So as the speaker is going through, I start marking my ballot while the presentation is happening. And the way I approach that is I look at the criteria that are a lot easier to gauge as the presentation is happening, such as language and delivery. So halfway through the presentation, I'll look at those criteria, gauge where I think the presenter is, because at that point you have a decent sense of how they've used their voice, how appropriate the speech is, and you can start thinking about that and marking it. about 3/4 of the way through the speech, and obviously there's not a clear way to judge 3/4 of the way. I just use my intuition in a sense and where I think the speaker is. And if the speaker said, I'm going to give you 3 points, and by the time they get to the 3rd point, I know they're getting close to the end. So I start marking specific numbers for those 2 areas. When I have the 1 minute, I focus really intently on the content piece because that is a higher percentage of the ballot, and to me one of the more critical pieces of a presentation. So I want to give it more dedicated focus, and it's a lot harder to fully gauge without hearing the whole speech. So by the time the speech is finished, I've probably filled in delivery and language, and then in the 1 minute I fill in content. And that allows me to give it a lot more focus and then move on to the next speaker and be ready to hear and listen as that minute is up. That's typically how I approach the ballot. I'm happy to answer specific questions if somebody wants to chat a question in the box, or as we get towards the end to take more specifics about any of the criteria.
So Nita, a question for you that I had. Is that 1 minute between speakers a rule in Toastmasters? Is that a specific rule, or is that just a time that we give?
It is a specific rule in the rule book as far as I remember. I have not, and I should have probably checked the 2018 rule book right before this webinar, but it has been a rule.
Okay. Do you use a separate sheet of paper to jot down notes about content as the speaker is speaking?
It depends. If there are only 4 or 5 speakers, then I space them out on the ballot and jot down my notes in the boxes. I have pretty tiny handwriting, so it works for me. I don't have to use a separate
Good for
piece
you.
of paper.
Wow. That's impressive.
If there's more than 4 or 5 speakers, then I do use a separate piece of paper to jot down notes. I think the notes are particularly helpful when I'm thinking about that content piece, but even more important is when at the end I'm looking across the tally, and if I have anybody that's very, very close, like within the points of each other or tied, then it allows me to go back to my notes and help me determine which piece might need more weight or not based on what notes I might have jotted down.
Okay. Does anybody have questions for Nita at this point? And I don't see any questions in the chat. Wonderful. Thank you very much. So Mark, if you want to now share how you use the ballot, that would be great.
Thank you. I have to say that I am very much similar to that which I just heard Nita describe. I do have what I consider a system for doing it, but I too have gone through the different processes of doing plus or minuses, doing the, do I like this, do I like that? And I finally realized that the ballot is the attempt at objective judgment on subjective judgment. And so it's in the same way that we know basketball, you get a 1 point at a foul, you get 2 points with regular shots and 3 points from, I guess, outside 22 feet. The same thing is that these are actually points. And so while we described the content, delivery, and language as 50% and 30% and 20%, each of the individual rows represent parts of those percentages. For example, the 3 parts of the 50 is speech development is 20, effectiveness is 15, speech value is 15. I actually see these as points. As I have later discovered, when you look at the accredited speaker ballot, which our recent Joe Grunin has just achieved, they actually, it is very similar to this ballot, and they have to get 80 points or more on that ballot in order to become an accredited speaker. And that's how I really solidified it for me, that it's about earning points. So on that basis, I see the system as having the 4 blocks of excellent, very good, good, or fair. And we can be too often lazy and say, oh, that was excellent, that was excellent, that was excellent. And I actually tend to think of almost never is it excellent, and that actually there's always room for improvement. If anything, if I had a tie, I would use the excellent box as the tie. So for me, the question really came down to is I have a two-question approach. First is, in each of the row categories, following the rules of the criteria as described on the back of the ballot, I've had the one question followed by a second question. The first question I ask is, in this category row, was it fair, was it good, or was it very good? That's my first question. I'm not even considering the excellence at this point. So it's one of those three boxes. Once I settle in with the answer to that first question, I go to the second question. This is much like Nita described as her two-tier process. To me, it's a two-question process. The second question is I use terminology to help other people remember the system as well, and I call it the quite or barely system. And that is, the second question is, once I've settled in on which of those boxes, say for example I say, okay, speech development is good. It's better than fair, but it's not quite very good, so it's good. So I've settled in, answered my first question. The second question then becomes, well, was it barely good, or was it quite good? The idea being, much like Nita said with the high, low, and middle, is that is it on the bottom end of good, so it's barely good, or is it on the other end? It's almost very good, then it's quite good. And I chose quite instead of very because somehow very good just doesn't sound right. So it sounded easier to just say quite good. So I use the barely quite system to answer my second question. So that then tells me I have to look at where the numbers are in the ballot for that particular row category. That it's not just a matter of taking averages of numbers, but what numbers has Toastmasters International put into that box. So for example, on speech development, they put the numbers 9 to 13 are the numbers for good. So if I said it was barely good, then I would probably choose the bottom number 9, maybe 10. If it was quite good, then I would choose 13, maybe 12. And if it was in the middle, then of course I would choose 11. And I use that number system all the way through for every single row. Now the thing that I came to discover was that the rows in the contest ballot have an amazing appearance of connection to the legacy CC manual, the Competent Communicator manual. The speech development is Competent Communicator Speech Project number 2. The effectiveness row is CC number 3. Speech value doesn't have one necessarily, but physical is Competent Communicator Project number 5. Voice is Competent Communicator Project 6. Manner, again, is the combination of those. Appropriateness and correctness are both Competent Communicator Project 4. And so I start to realize how connected these are to the legacy Competent Communicator. And I say legacy because I realize we're about to go into pathways, and that might change things. But the point I'm saying is that I realized the connection to what we were learning in the Competent Communicator Manual, and I use what those criteria absolutely say. And I use the numeric system of the points that are assigned in each of those boxes, depending on whether it is barely, or quite. So that's the system that I particularly use. The one thing I have noticed is that it's really important for us to understand that a speech has to have value. And that's actually the speech value row category, is that very often we'll just go with something that we like, but did the speech have value? And very often there will be times where it is not as much of a value as we might have otherwise thought. And so even though I might have liked what I heard and enjoyed it, I find myself always measuring, did this speech actually say something meaningful, and was it original to the audience? Because that's actually what it describes in the description on the back side of the judging criteria. So these are
Mark,
I'm done.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. So your definition of value is what?
Well, according to the ballot, actually, because it's not even about what I would define, but rather it says speech value justifies the act of speaking. The speaker has a responsibility to say something meaningful and original to the audience. The listeners should feel the speaker has made a contribution to their thinking. The ideas should be important ones, although this does not preclude a humorous presentation of them. So the audience should walk away with something. So in other words, I have seen a speech I would consider as a cartoon. And while it was cartoonish, we didn't walk away learning anything. We didn't walk away hearing anything or thinking anything. And so that it wasn't necessarily something that really contributed to our thinking. And so that's something that I would not have been able to rank much above maybe the quite fair, but that's probably as much as it would be able to get as far as I'm concerned. My point being is that's just one row category, but there are other categories and there are other things that somebody might have a better way made up in the other rows. So really it's not just what we liked about the speech in an overall. We have to add up all the points, and the points are what tell us how many points this speech earned, and that's the judgment of first, second, and third is how they earned those points. It's earning those points, trying to create an objective system out of what otherwise would be purely subjective. That's my approach anyway.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Mark. Does anybody have any questions for Mark or Nita at this point? Now, I'd like to open it up to anyone on this call who would like to share how they use the judge's ballot. Does anybody have anything they would like to share? While you're thinking about that type of a question, or you can either unmute yourself and ask your question or put it in the contest chat, I have to say that I find what Nita and Mark, what you have shared, extremely valuable. Even though I've been a Toastmaster for a number of years, I've never been through the official training and really did struggle with the ballot since, like many people in our district, and I suspect it's true across Toastmasters in general, I was given a ballot, said, okay, it's time for you to be a judge, and I'm looking at this ballot knowing it's a very important tool in helping someone to, on their journey to the contest or whatever their goals are, and I didn't want to make a mistake. I wanted to make sure that what I was judging was absolutely fair, but I had no idea how to do that. And I'm a very emotional being, so when I listen to a speech, of course, I'm listening to it emotionally and trying to keep the emotion out of it. And I wasn't sure, how do I do that? How do I keep the emotion out of it? And I read the guide and I understood at a logical level what I was supposed to do, but I just couldn't seem to get past that. So that's why instead of judging, I like being chief judge. So then I can tell others how to judge, and hopefully they've caught on to how, to an effective method that works for them. But for me to actually be a judge up until this point was very intimidating because I didn't want to make a mistake and potentially screw up somebody's path to whatever journey they wanted to be on. I'm not sure if anybody else on the call has felt that way, if I'm the only one, but I wanted to share that with everyone. Does anybody have any questions or anything they'd like to share at this point? And thank you very much, Jeff, for your comment in chat. The comment in chat is Mark is correct about the correlation with the CC speech projects. That is one of the reasons why judges must complete 6 speeches to be eligible to judge at the International Speech Contest at area level and above. So thank you very much for that, Jeff. So great correlation, Mark, on the CC manual and the judge's ballot. Any questions or comments at this point?
Hi, this is Teresa Smith. I'm interested to hear that as a judge, Nita and Mark, I believe you both stated that you have jotted down notes as you're being a judge. And I'm curious as to what type of notes that you're jotting down to help you make the distinction on what number and what category of whether it's good, fair, etc. Can you help explain that a little bit?
Ladies first.
This is Nita. Great, thanks, Mark. This is Nita. Thanks for the question, Therese. So I tried to jot down notes relative to the pointers under each element. For example, some of the easier ones, let's say voice, flexibility, volume, vocal variety. When you think about voice, I put a note there if I heard areas in the speech where they had a lot of variety, or sometimes my note might say deadpan all throughout, and that's just to remind me that I just didn't hear that, so that when I go to put in the number, I have the justification for why I might have rated them fair or slightly lower. The more interesting notes for me, similar to the area where I like to focus, is in the content. And in some of the delivery under manner, I think how a speaker approaches their topic as well as the audience is important in conveying messages. So under content, I would probably make a note about the logic. Was it organized in a way that it led me to the same conclusion the speaker was trying to point out? And for that, I might put gave clear examples, here's one, or I might just put the word of whatever that example was just to trigger my brain. They're not super long or complicated notes, especially when I'm using just the ballot and filling in information on the ballot as opposed to a separate piece of paper. I probably only have maybe 8 or 10 bulleted type items of notes. I don't take detailed notes. I just use the notes as a way to help me gauge why I might think of somebody as very good versus good. If I found that I'm leaning toward very good under, for example, achievement of purpose, I try to write down what I felt the purpose was and how it was reemphasized. That way, when I go back to look at it, I say, yes, that really did come across. That was really part of the presentation, or nope, I don't know why I put that note down. By the end, I didn't get that at all. So it helps me make some of those choices towards the filling in the numbers part. You don't have to take super complicated notes. I think these notes are really for you to help you trigger your memory, because by the time you've heard a 5 to 7 minute speech, it's hard to remember all the elements that might have happened at the beginning and why you might have been moved to a certain opinion. Because ultimately some of these, even though we're trying to be as objective and critical and fair about it, they really are opinions to some extent. And so I use the notes to help me clarify why did I come to that opinion, and how does my note help me justify the number that I'm giving or not giving, or do I just remember enough about the speech that when I do have to choose between a tie to say, where was it that really threw this presentation into the higher rated category or not?
Yep.
Mark, was that your addition to that answer?
No,
Sorry, that was Teresa. That was me.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say Mark was short and sweet. Yep. What Nita said. Mark.
I've got something to say about that as well. I like Nita, I too do not take copious or very demonstrative notes because there's not a lot of space and there's not a lot of time. And I do also take I will start with a number in the middle where as I'm listening to this, I'm thinking they're at, and then as I've listened to the speech, I may adjust it accordingly, because I'm doing that, so as Nita rightly said earlier, we've only got 1 minute afterwards, so I'm beginning that process. But there will be times, as an example of how I might do a note, is I will actually take tallies, and I'll put a tally in the left top corner of the box on the top right. For example, on effectiveness, the backside actually says, asks you, was I able to determine the speaker's purpose? Did the speech directly relate to that purpose? And these are actually the questions that we learned in the Competent Communicator Project number 3, Get to the Point, where we actually, that's really the first question I'm asking myself when I hear any speech get started is, what is the general purpose and what is the specific purpose of this speech? And that right there is CC number 3, which is the effectiveness row. And so what I will do is that I will make a tally. If I can determine the general purpose, I might put a check or 1 tally in the top left corner of their box for the point, and then if they have a specific purpose, I'll put a check there, and I can determine whether I heard those or whether I could identify those. That would be one example. Another example would be is when you start getting down into the appropriateness and correctness language. I listen for alliterations and metaphors, because very often speakers don't use those and then will just continue to speak and everybody thinks, well, it's just good language. But really, Competent Communicator Project 4 teaches us to use rhetorical tools. So I will listen for rhetorical tools and I will create a tally, again, on the left corner perhaps for if I heard how many alliterations, maybe on the top right corner, how many metaphors I may have heard. And so that really gives me an idea of that. So that would be a way I would take notes. But as for taking a separate piece of paper and writing down all kinds of things, there just isn't time for that. It's just not available. So really, I may have a very messy ballot counting through the process. By the time I'm done, I'm ending up with a number that I'm very happy with, and I've got the basis for understanding how I came to those exact number of points.
Okay,
that's helpful. Thank you very much. Can I ask another question?
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, sorry. Apologies, Teresa. Let me just ask one quick question that's related to the notes. Michael Aaron has posted or asked in the conference chat, I assume the notes you are taking are to be destroyed just like the top of the ballot.
That is correct.
Perfect.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
I do it on the exact same page. I don't take other pieces of paper.
Okay, perfect. And Jeff has responded with there's no official rule about judges' notes. The rules state that the top of the ballot must be discreetly discarded. We tell judges to destroy the top part. And when Jeff judges, he puts all his notes on the top of the ballot. So they just get shredded with his math. So thank you very much for that, Jeff. Teresa, I apologize. Thank you very much. Go ahead and ask your second question.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. As far as, I guess I struggle with this a little bit, and maybe I'm just not reading the criteria and guidance well enough to understand when a speaker does chime in with ahs, ers, or what have you. How do you take that into account? Like, which field would that, which criteria would that fit in, or do you not take that into consideration? I'm thinking it's part of the speech portion, but I just wondering what others are doing.
Typically, I put that under language for correctness, and it has some weight, but as you'll note, it doesn't have a lot of weight. I think, as Mark mentioned earlier, one of the key elements, and even the judging forum drives you towards it, is content and meaning and value and effectiveness of delivering that thought and idea, not necessarily the effectiveness of simply delivery. There is delivery, but it is a smaller percentage of the total, and then language is even slightly smaller. So for me, I would put it under correctness. On certain ballots, there's also sincerity, manner, directness, and that's under delivery. So there might be some influence that goes there as well, but it would never go under the content part.
Okay.
I would agree with that. My thought process is that typically we don't hear too many ahs, ers, and ums, but that would be something that would probably be more something either manner or correctness. But again, you're not going to see it that often, especially at the higher levels of contest speeches that you hear. It's certainly not a content issue. It's perhaps more of a delivery issue, which that's why I tend to think of it more as manner, which is the one item that really doesn't have a connection or correlation specifically to the Legacy Competent Communicator Manual. The ability to deliver it, ahs and ums, is kind of a way of filling sound for your silence. So the enthusiasm that you're bringing somehow can be interfered with that. So that's where I tend to see it more as a
This is Teresa. Did I just lose everybody, or?
No, I think, Mark, we lost you.
You don't hear me?
Well, for a period of time, you went. We lost you.
Oh,
so
wow.
Yeah.
What was the last thing I was heard saying?
You were talking about not putting it under content and maybe correctness and manner. So you were just saying that you were agreeing with some of the comments I had made.
I was more or less agreeing with that. I said ultimately it's a delivery issue because use of ahs, ers, and ums is a filler of space, of time, that you could actually just have a stately pause instead of a common ah. So for me, it's not so much a correctness of language, and specifically as the correctness description of the criterion says, correctness of language ensures that attention will be directed toward what the speaker says, not how it is said. So I suppose if you think utterance is what they're saying, then I suppose that could apply. It's really the combination between manner and correctness. And if you're looking for determining the difference between the one person versus another, if that's the way you're thinking about it, well, it's manner or correctness, either way, whichever you feel better with on that one. I don't think that's a specific one you have to worry too badly about, especially the higher levels up you go. You won't see too many others and ums.
Agreed. Thank you.
Great questions, Teresa. Thank you very much. Thank you, Nita and Mark, for answering those quite effectively. Does anybody else have any questions that they would like to ask?
Yeah, this is Jeff. I'd like to know from Mark and Nita how you guys judge your manner, because as Mark mentioned earlier, that one to me still seems nebulous, undefined.
I'll let Mark go first since I've been hogging the first step.
Well, I don't think it's been hogging. I've been happy for ladies first. It's been a policy of life for me. But if you would prefer I go first, I'm happy to do that as well, Nita.
Yes, please.
Certainly. The question of manner, as the criterion says to us, manner is the indirect revelation of the speaker's real self as the speech is delivered. The speaker should speak with enthusiasm and assurance, showing interest in the audience and confidence in their reactions. I think one of the elements we can identify is how natural is the person speaking. And when they're up there speaking, do you feel that their manner is contrived? Or do you feel that it's natural? Do you feel that they're comfortable being up there? How is their manner of presentation of the overall speech? So it's a matter of psychological evaluation, I suppose, if you will. You're determining what are you seeing in front of you. Yes, we've got content. Yes, we've got language. Yes, we've got delivery. Yes, we've got some person doing certain things. But how are they? Is their face smiling? Are they confident in what they're saying? Are they timid in what they're saying? How is that being delivered? And that's actually how I see the manner that's the most nebulous or the most vulnerable, if you will, or subjective that we have to determine. It really is, what do you think you're seeing in front of you when you see the speakers speaking? What is their manner? And different people have different styles. This isn't to say, for example, a person who has great enthusiasm and super vivacious ideas and the way they're bombasticness and all that versus somebody else who's not so much like that. Different personality types will have different ways of being about them, but how confident do they come across in what they're doing in their own personality style? That's what I think manner is really about.
I would agree with Mark on this. I think it's authenticity is the word I think of when I think of manner. I think, do they believe in what they're saying? Are they presenting it in the manner that seems true to them? Do they feel as though they're staging their presentation? Because a speech is not a performance in the sense of acting. I think sometimes people are swayed a little bit by presenters who seem extremely polished versus those that might be a little bit more reserved, when that really isn't, well, not only is it only 10% of a particular ballot, but it's not the determining factor of what makes a speech. And I think manner has to be both authentic to the person, but authentic to the message and authentic to the style of the delivery of the message. And you can know that by their engagement in the presentation, and that engagement just has to be appropriate to the presentation. It doesn't need to be a well-acted speech in the sense to make manner be really high. It might have to be if that's what the subject required or needed in order to pull it off, but usually that's not the case. So I'm agreeing with Mark in terms of how does the person present themselves, and can you believe them, believe their the way they're delivering that message.
Great answer. Thank you very much. Great questions. Any other questions for Nita and Mark? Does anyone have anything else that they would like to offer forward on their use of the ballot, how they would use it, what their experience has been?
So this is Teresa again. Are you getting ready to close the call, or?
No, nope,
Okay.
not at this point. I still have a couple of slides that I would like to present if we have time. I do love the fact that we have so many questions that are coming forward, and I really would like to hear from other individuals who are on this call and who have had experiences as a judge using the ballot, whether it's been a good experience, whether it's something that it was a pitfall they had, or a negative experience they had that they learned from. I want to hear that side of it as well. If anybody has anything that they would like to share on that.
Hi, this is Eliana.
Hi, Eliana.
So I have been a judge like 3 times. I think for me I have stuck to it because like they were commenting, sometimes you want to avoid being subjective. So it has helped me to be objective. I think overall it has worked for me. Sometimes it is kind of like I try to give the 1 to 10 number, so then sometimes it's just adding everything that just kind of slows me down sometimes. But I think overall it's a it's a method and it's objective.
So how did you go from being subjective to being objective? How did you make the transition?
Like sticking to the guidelines. I'm sticking to how it says there, like how was there the guidelines that they give at the back, and they explain if if it was structured, the message, it's also like the presentation, their delivery. So just focusing on the points that it says there. So that's what I do. I know, like it says, you could use any other method as long as it's the same across the board of the speakers, but like for me that works because it would just be too complicated for me to try to do something else and then try and be fair at the same time. So I think overall that has worked well for me, the guideline that Toastmasters has in that format.
Yeah, great point. Great point. Thank you very much for that. Did somebody else have something they wanted to share?
This is Nita. There was one point I was going to make about the ballot, which I don't think I've heard tonight, and to me it's one of the key elements, is that no matter what format or tool you use, the real key to being a judge is to be consistent. If you can be consistent in evaluating every speaker, if you decide you're only going to look at the 4 most important criteria on that ballot, whatever those 4 might be to you, then those should be the 4 that you look at for every single speaker, so that you're looking at each speaker against the same points and not picking and choosing, not deciding, oh, this speaker I'm going to weigh this more, or this speaker I'm going to weigh this more. It's the consistency, I think, is really important, and that will make whatever format and whatever tool you use be as fair and objective as it can be. So it's almost not that important to be exactly verbatim to everything, but you need to be consistent and in line with the consistent. Just look at the top categories and look at the weighing that it gives. If content is 55%, hold to that and be consistent. You don't have to worry too much about the breakdown in between the content, but you just need to give it more weight than the presentation style. And I've seen where sometimes I've noticed where speakers and judges tend to really focus on the delivery and the language when that's much less important than the content. So as long as you can be consistent and look at the top level general guidelines, you should be fine. You don't have to get wrapped up in all the details of the points and the exact numbers and each of the subcategories. That can be daunting, especially for new judges. But if you can get your hands around the top core pieces and the breakout, then I think you can do a good job.
Yeah, that's a great point. One of the first contests that I judged, sorry Mark, I'll give you the floor in just a minute. One of the first contests that I judged, the chief judge kept emphasizing a slick delivery does not mean it's a great speech. And that individual kept emphasizing that point. So thank you very much, Nita, for that. Mark, go ahead.
I concur with what you just said there as well. I'm not sure I heard what was just recently described completely. If you're saying the top four, are you meaning like speech development, effectiveness, speech value, and physical, and ignore the rest? Or are you saying, when you talk about as long as you're consistent? I don't know that I would agree with that. But I would agree that it does need to be consistent. I do think that it needs to be points. And I think that the way of getting to the point system is that the ballot is available to us 24/7, 365 days a year. And I think that really what we should be doing is we should be getting a hold of the ballots a month, 2 months before the contest even begins. And you can start practicing just for the fun of it. When you're in your own Toastmasters meetings, have copies of the ballots. You don't have to share it with anybody else. You're just practicing. And just practice looking and hearing what you hear in the speeches and trying to determine how you can follow the points based on the descriptions on the back page of the ballot guide. So you can practice that so that the idea of using what Nita called the two-tier system, what I call the asking 2 questions of very good, good, or fair, and then quite, or barely, barely, those points, I think, really should be considered important. And the way you can make that easy to do is to learn it in advance of a contest and practice using it even on speeches that don't matter in terms of contest-wise. You can certainly feel free to apply this in learning to teach yourself how to use the ballot, watching speeches in your own meetings long before the contest takes place. I would encourage, and I would like to see people more and more familiar with the judging ballot so that it's not viewed as something they just see when they show up at the contest for the first time and then they're surprised and inundated and overwhelmed by everything it requires. I think you can make this so much easier by becoming familiar with it well in advance. I would like to see us dedicated to the point system because, as I pointed out, the accredited speaker system uses it as points, and I think that's teaching us, that guides us, that Toastmasters does expect us to use it as a point system, and they have assigned what those points should be based on what they put in the ballot system. I would like to see us focus on the points to try to get to the closest of objectivity as Toastmasters has led for us to do it, and the reason is because of this reason most of all, more than anything else. We have an obligation to the contestants. We have an obligation to them. And that's why I think we need to make sure if they're building their speeches based on the ballot, we should be judging based on the ballot.
Yeah, that's a great point. And as a matter of fact, I'm the chief judge for our one of my clubs. I've already emailed out to all of the members, because we have a lot of new members. I've already emailed everybody the judge's ballot for the International Speech Contest and the Table Topics Contest, because I want everyone aware of what the ballot is, what the judging criteria is, so that come the day of, we're not having shocked faces. So great point there as well. Now, Michael posted a question in the chat that I'm going to read out loud. Jeff has answered, so I will read his answer. Michael asked if there's a problem getting volunteers to sign up for judges and other roles. Is it legal for the chief judge to act as a judge and fill out the ballot, or should the chief judge definitely refrain from filling out the ballot? This would be at the club or area level. Jeff's response: the chief judge should not fill out any ballot The rulebook, Section 5, General Procedure, Section J, says there will be 1 minute of silence between contestant speeches during which voting judges and the tie-breaking judge will mark their ballots. All voting judges and the tie-breaking judge will judge all contestants. The chief judge does not judge contestants. So great question, Mark. Thank you, Jeff, for that response. Does anyone have any other questions or comments?
This is Teresa again. So we're coming up on the international, we're in the season for international speech contests. So in being a judge for this contest, and I'm more focused on the international speech versus the table topics, when you're listening to the topic, when you're listening to the content, are there specific things that you're looking for to ensure that it truly would be international, like anybody in the world could get something from that? And how do you do that?
Great question, Teresa. Mark and Nita, before you answer, I just want to do a time check. We are 5 minutes from the top of the hour. So if you guys want to use a couple of minutes each, and then I'll wrap it up. It sounds obviously like this is a topic that we can talk about for hours, and I would be more than willing to do a second judging question or a judging webinar specifically about that type of thing, Teresa, where Mark had spoken about it before this. We started this webinar specifically on how to break down the individual sections of the ballot and how you would judge very specific the criteria. So this would be really geared towards the question that Teresa just asked. So watch your calendars for that. So based on Teresa's question, thank you very much. Mark, why don't you go ahead and give us a 2-minute response on what Teresa just asked, and then we'll hand the floor over to Nita for her response, and then we'll wrap it up.
Thank you. That's an excellent question. I do think that it is helpful if more people who judged actually watched the World Championship of Public Speaking and actually saw what is expected at that level and understand that there is what I call the difference between a contest speech and a club speech. The reason why I refer to a club speech is that very often in clubs we will do a speech and we only have to do it once. And we're doing it once, so we're not spending a year's worth of rehearsals and editing to do it for a contest speech, whereas the club speech is more convenient. It doesn't require as much. So I think that if more people saw the World Championship of Public Speaking, saw what the level of speeches are, they'd have an idea of what's actually expected at the higher levels. I think that that would be very valuable for people to see. For me, first, I want to know what is the purpose of this speech when I hear it. What am I going to walk away learning from this? And then, did they get my attention in the beginning? Am I wanting to yawn? Am I paying attention? Am I learning? Are the anecdotes that they're using connecting? Because you also have to realize, even though we don't see project number 10 of the Competent Communicator Manual, it's connecting. And the real top winners really try to make that connection, that emotional and intellectual connection between the speaker and the audience. And I'm really looking forward to what makes that connection. What really brings me in? What do I walk away as a speech of value? So certainly I want to care about the content, want to make sure that it flows correctly through itself, and then I want to make sure the delivery is well, and are they moving around, and do gestures have a reason? They're not just being a symphony conductor and raising their arms up and down, but they actually have gestures tied to a concept. And then of course they're using appropriate language like alliteration and metaphors. These are the types of things I look for to be standout speeches as I'm watching that. So that's an excellent question, and I would encourage everybody, watch the World Championship of Public Speaking, go to toastmastersondemand.com, buy the copies from the past, watch them as they happen in August. That's how you see what real contest level speeches are supposed to be.
Thanks, Mark. Nita, go ahead.
Yep, Nita. I have a slightly different take on the answer to that question. I do not believe there is a single structure or style of presentation that is appropriate for an international speech. There is not something you can define that this is an international speech. What I can tell you, though, is that the ideas, the logic, the way the person structured their material to convince you, to get you to their same understanding, to relate to you, to bring some sense of, I'm glad I spent the last 7 minutes listening to this person speak because they made me think differently. Not that I agreed or not that I disagreed, but that it just made me think. And they structured it and presented their logic in a way that I could relate to it. It could bring me to how they came to this conclusion. And if a person can do that, I believe it is of value, and that would be criteria enough to be an international speech. I don't think there is a general sense of these types of speeches are the most appropriate material or these types of speeches aren't. I think an individual can do that with something very mundane as why cell phones should be banned from kids under 3, to something as dramatic as this is how to completely change your outlook and structure on life to embrace new challenges, right? Those are all appropriate levels of topic and everything in between and outside of them. But how do they get you to that? How do they present it? Where is their thought? Where is their logic? Is it something worthy of listening to in the sense that it makes you think, would be my criteria.
Thank you both. I appreciate that.
Great questions and great responses. Thank you very much. And as much as I hate to say it, we are at the top of the hour. I want to thank Mark Henkel and Nita Patel, our 2 panelists, for this evening's topic, how to use the ballot for the upcoming International Contest and Table Topics contest. I encourage everyone strongly to please be a judge. This is how you learn. And I encourage you also to complete the survey for this webinar. Please let us know what you thought of the webinar. I put the link in the conference chat. It's sprinkled in there a couple of times. Please go ahead and complete that. As I said, we are recording this presentation. We will be posting it up on our District 45 online YouTube channel. We are always looking for more topics and individuals who are willing to share their experience with fellow District 45 Toastmaster members. So once again, thank you very much to Mark and Nita. This was extremely helpful for me as someone who was a little shy to be a judge in the past. Certainly, I will take that on moving forward. So thank you very much for that. Thank you, everyone, for your time. If you have any questions, please feel free to send me an email or send Jeff an email, and he'll redirect it my way. And we look forward to seeing you in the future on future webinars. Continue to watch the District 45 Facebook page and the District 45 calendar on our website for upcoming webinars. Thanks, everybody. I wish you all a great evening, and thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sharon.
Thank you.
Thank you. So Jeff, if you want to go ahead and stop the recording, that would be awesome.